You published a great book. We've talked about it on the podcast before, back in 2018, Never Lose a Customer Again. And now recently you've released this second book, Never Lose an Employee Again. My question is why? Why write this book and why write now?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that, James Robert, because this book was actually supposed to come out a while ago. Here's what happened. I've been doing customer experience for almost 25, 30 years now. And I was into my customer experience journey for about all of 5 minutes before I realized that you can't have a remarkable customer experience if you don't have remarkable employees to help you deliver that experience. The challenge is most organizations see customer experience and employee experience as two separate entities, as opposed to how I see them as two sides of the same coin. So several years ago, I went to my publisher and said, I want to write my second book. I want it to be called Never Lose an Employee Again. They said, great. We worked out the details and we started off doing the research, doing the interview, doing the interviews, doing the writing. And as we were going through this process, along comes the COVID pandemic. And I actually called them up and I, at the risk of sounding overly dramatic, I was like, stop the presses. We got to pause here because my gut tells me that the world of work as we know it is about to undergo a massive change. Now, hindsight being 2020, I would posit that what happened in the last few years is the greatest change in the workplace in the history of the world. And I'm happy to extrapolate on why I believe that. But I'm so glad that we paused because it allowed us to think even more strategically, more long-term, more evergreen about the importance of how we care for our people, especially in this world of increasing hybrid work, work from home, remote work, this world of increasing globalization, this world of increasing digitization over analog interactions, this shift in the graying of the workforce and kind of the bringing in the new next breed of young leaders and, workers and team members and entrepreneurs who are going to take our species into the future. I feel like pausing it a little bit and then being able to build some of that in, hopefully created a much better experience for the readers.
I appreciate that perspective because as we were going through the COVID experience, I was just publishing my first book, Banking on Digital Growth, which looked at digital experience in the context of human experience, where I was thinking digital experience plus human experience, well, that leads to growth. And through the COVID experience, I was thinking, oh my goodness, I have made a cardinal sin. I've forgotten the most important element of all of this, which is the employee experience, back to your point, which is why I'm working on my second book now that takes well, how do we guide people through the complexity here? So it's interesting to hear the parallel perspective, but also too, we are living in a period of massive transformation, dare I say even exponential transformation that we've never experienced before. Let's get into why you're thinking that this is the biggest transformation that we've experienced around work. What's that rooted in right now?
Well, James Robert, I totally agree with you that we are in an exponential era. And the challenge with living in an exponential era where everything is faster, bigger, more impactful than arguably any other time in human history is that we have linear brains and biology. Our brains and our ecosystem, our bodies were not designed for the type of accelerated growth and change we're seeing. And I think that's why so many humans globally are struggling. Humans, as a general rule, don't like change. But when we take change at a scale and a magnitude that is greater than anything we've ever experienced, it creates messy situations, to say the least. Now, the reason I think this is the most significant change in the history of the world is I've been unable to identify any other time in human history where a single event impacted every human on the world in every industry in the world at the same time. Now, some people will say, well, Joey, what about the Industrial Revolution? Well, friends, there are parts of the world that you can go to right now in 2023 that the Industrial Revolution still hasn't reached. Some people might say, well, Joey, what about the internet and connectivity? Absolutely. But I can go to Main Street America and find businesses that don't even have a website, and yet they're operating in this internet digital era. What no one was able to escape was the impact of lockdowns, the impact of shifting perspectives, the impact of a supply chain crunching in a way that we had never felt before. We hadn't had the level of globalization we had pre-COVID at any other time in human history. You could find all the things you needed to survive as a general rule within about 50 miles of your house at any given time in human history. Now, how we define what you need to survive certainly has evolved and changed. But when we look at the connectivity of the human race, both in terms of supply chains, the internet, our communications, the way we do business globally, having all of that kind of grind to a halt, buckle a couple of gears, and then try to rebuild back in an entirely different environment, I just don't think we'd ever seen anything like that before.
That's a great point. And it's, once again, I think it's a matter of perspective. Perspective is the sum of context and framing. And this was an experience, the COVID experience, that impacted everyone across all different verticals, across all different industries, countries, nationalities, etc. And that's where you open up the book with a letter to readers. And you share some thinking that across all different business lines and business sizes and industries, there's a common complaint that you hear from business leaders, particularly over the past 30 years of experience that you've had. And that complaint is this: I wish my employees cared. I wish they cared about the business as much as I do as a leader. But you also provide another, I say, an empathetic perspective that's based upon the research that you did for writing this book. And you also found that your employees, for those who are listening, those who are watching, that your employees wish you cared as much about them as you do about the business. What do you mean by this, Joey?
Well, let me begin, James Robert, by saying, for all the business leaders, the owners, the founders, the CEOs out there, I come from a place of empathy first, in that as a fellow business leader, business owner, CEO, I understand that you actually do care about your people, and you care about them deeply, and you think about them all the time. You think about them even when they're not aware that you're thinking about them. You're wondering, how am I going to make payroll? How am I going to keep them retained? How am I going to keep them engaged? How am I going to make sure we have enough work to keep them all employed? I know that you're regularly thinking about that. The problem is your team members, your employees, aren't you. They don't know what you're thinking. They don't know what you're feeling unless you tell them or show them. And the challenge with this is we have a tendency as leaders to often over-index on the tell part instead of the show part. Yeah. We say, oh, you really matter to me. We get everybody together for the all hands meeting. Oh, we couldn't do this without you. Great, thanks. But I feel like I'm overworked and underpaid. I feel like I'm not appreciated. My boss is an idiot, and everyone knows my boss is an idiot, and yet you still keep them employed as a middle manager. I don't have any insight as to where my career is going. I feel like you want me as an employee to answer emails after hours, be available if we need to do a late night call with a team overseas, do all these things. But God forbid I want to take a phone call during the workday from my kid's school, from the nurse. I feel shame and guilt that I've answered my phone at work. And there's just this opportunity, I think, to change how we approach our interactions with our team members in a way that shows them just how much we care about them. I would posit, James Robert, that the employers of choice in the next decade, the people that every smart, talented, rock star employee is going to want to go work for, are the companies that care more about what happens between 5 p.m. and 9 a.m. in their employees' lives than care about what happens between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. In other words, what is your life outside of the workplace? And how can I, as your employer, as your leader, create an environment that acknowledges that honors that, and helps create the space for you to succeed in both, to not have to make the Hobbesian choice of, well, which one do you care more about?
How do you bridge that gap between thinking about what happens between 5 p.m. and 9 a.m.? Because I think, my thinking is transformed over this through the COVID experience. Before this, it was about trying to find some type of work-life balance. But now I'm looking at this through a different lens of work-life integration, trying to bring the best self to work and bring the best self home. I'm looking at this from what I'm framing as exponential growth, that I define as when someone perceives they are growing personally and professionally at the same exact time. Because what is impacting you professionally will impact you personally. What impacts you personally will impact you professionally. But as a leader, how do we navigate maybe some of the challenging conversations that need to first and foremost happen with ourselves around this subject before we can facilitate this with those that we're leading?
James Robert, I love that you started with self first, because any leader has to get clear on their own lens on these topics before we start projecting to the tactics and the strategies that we want to do with our people. For most leaders, not all, but most, I would posit, they are probably over-indexing on work over personal. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I'm just saying if I were to go to the average leader, the average person listening or watching our show today, and say, show me your calendar for last week, I will see more blocks of time allocated to quote unquote work activities than I will see allocated to personal activities on the typical leader's calendar. Again, I'm not saying that's wrong, but you're a leader. You're a founder. You're a CEO. You're an entrepreneur. We have a tendency when we wear one of those titles or serve in one of those roles to forget that the majority of humans aren't like us. The majority of humans don't want to be entrepreneurs. The majority of humans don't want to be CEOs. Sure, they want some of the trappings of those things or the perceived realities of those things, but that's not the way they're hardwired. They want, to your point, maybe if at the risk of sounding pejorative or judgmental, a healthier balance between where they spend their work time and where they spend their personal time. For most folks, I'll speak just for myself, my work time is so personal. I am so connected to it, into my identity, that don't tell anyone. I, in some ways, do it for free because I love doing it so much. But I'm weird that way. Not everyone is like that. And so the first step we have to recognize is our blueprint, our lens by which we view the world, is often antithetical and complete disjointment from the lens by which our team members or our employees view the world. So that's step number one. Step number two is getting comfortable with exploring the differences between those blueprints before we start to try to take action. Most leaders are like, give me the 3-point plan. I can start implementing tomorrow. Like, I'm right. What are the steps, Joey? Walk me through. Here's an interesting thing to just check your assumptions on this, or anybody who's joining us for the conversation today. When you see a team member on Monday, if they are a coworker or an employee, you often might say, what'd you do this weekend? If they are a colleague, or you are invested in your team at a deep level, you're saying things like, how was Jenny's birthday party? How was the graduation ceremony? What did you think of the movie? Because you know what they had planned for the weekend. You don't have to ask them what they did. The relationship is so close, is so familiar, that you already know what they did. Now, briefly, before some folks are objecting and saying, Joey, I have 300 employees. There's no way I can know what they all do. I get it. But let's look at your closest direct reports or your executive team. Do you know the same answers for those folks? Or is that not even on your radar screen of considerations?